Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us here at Columbia University. My name is Jonathan Elkind. I'm a fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy. Throughout this academic year, the Center on Global Energy Policy has brought to the Columbia campus a number of outstanding practitioners and thinkers from around the globe to respond to the question that is the name of the speaker series, Where Next on Climate? This series came about because the Trump administration was calling for an abrupt change of direction on climate policy. The new president announced his intention to have the United States withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement, declared the intention to stop implementation of President Obama's Clean Power Plan and other emissions reduction programs. The administration proposed and continues to propose to radically reduce budgets for clean energy research and development, and even went to the lengths of calling into question the underlying science of human-caused climate change and removing the words climate change from government reports and websites. So against this backdrop, we have been focusing throughout the course of this academic year on a number of different parameters of future possible policy in regard to climate change. Tonight, we focus on corporate decision-making related to climate, which has been a particularly important aspect of the question. Corporate leaders often are investing in long-lived technologies. They decide operational practices and determine corporate priorities that translate concretely into how much greenhouse gases we emit. Corporate leaders, of course, also carry a fiduciary responsibility. They are charged with yielding returns for shareholders. So if we're going to succeed in the battle against climate change, we can only do that if one has both healthy and growing competitive economies and wise corporate decisions to reduce climate pollution. And that brings us to our program tonight. We are extremely pleased to have an outstanding group for this topic this evening. We'll be led off by Kevin Knobloch, who is a senior research fellow at the Center for International Environment and Resource Policy at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Kevin will present findings from research that he and a team of colleagues are now finalizing on the topic that you see before you on the screen. In terms of his background before Tufts University, Kevin served for 3.5 years in the Obama administration as chief of staff. Oops, sorry, Kevin. Can't get good help these days. Chief of staff at the U.S. Department of Energy, and before that was for 10 years the president of the Union of Concerned Scientists. Earlier in his career, he had worked on conservation programs at the Appalachian Mountain Club and as legislative director for Senator Tim Wirth of Colorado and legislative assistant for U.S. Representative Ted Weiss. Kevin holds a Master in Public Administration degree from the JFK School of Government at Harvard University and a Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Now, after Kevin's presentation, he will be joined by our other colleagues who you see before you. Dr. Jeffrey Heal is in the second from the end. I'm doing this in a way that will unfortunately be hard for you to follow. Is the Donald C. Waite III Professor of Social Enterprise in the Columbia Business School. Jeff has had an exceptionally active career at the junction point among academia, business, and sustainability. He's the author of 18 books, roughly 200 articles, and has an extremely lengthy list of other activities and accomplishments, including and service, having chaired a committee of the National Academy of Sciences on valuing ecosystem services, participation in the Pew Oceans Commission, serving as coordinating lead author of the IPCC's fifth assessment report, and serving currently as an advisor to the World Bank on its Green Growth Project. He teaches MBA courses here on current developments in energy markets, and perhaps my favorite, business and society, doing well by doing good, ? So we also are very pleased to have with us in the middle here Nancy Meyer. You can probably pick her out of the lineup. She is Director of Corporate Engagement at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, C2ES, as it is known to many of us. Nancy worked previously with IHS Markit, known to some previously as Cambridge Energy Research Associates. And before that, worked in the public sector at the Government Accountability Office, and also served in the Peace Corps in lovely Ganja, Azerbaijan. She has a Master of Public Affairs from Indiana University and a bachelor's from the University of Indianapolis. Last but not least, John McWilliams at the far side is a fellow at the Center on Global Energy Policy. John also served in government under the previous administration, where he was Associate Deputy Secretary of Energy and Chief Risk Officer. Before his government service, John served as partner of Tremont Energy Partners, LLC, a private investment firm based in Cambridge, Mass. In earlier corporate roles in investment banking, John was vice chairman at J.P. Morgan Chase for investment banking and partner of J.P. Morgan Partners. He was also founding partner of the Beacon Group, which was a private investment firm located in New York, and was partner and co-head of Beacon Group Energy Investment Funds, which was a portfolio invested in 30 global private equity investments in the energy industry. So with that, let me turn the floor over to Kevin in just one second. Let me mention, if I will, just to explain our order of march. Kevin will present his findings on the work that he and his colleagues have been doing at Tufts University. After that, we'll have a panel discussion, and toward the end of that, we'll be open for questions from the audience, including from those of you who are watching on the live web stream at present. I will note that, like all of the public events that the Center on Global Energy Policy runs, this event is being webcast live, and both the full video and the podcast and a podcast recording will be available on our website and iTunes in the coming days. Last, for those of you watching online, or for any of you who are so inclined here in the audience, you may submit a question at any time using the hashtag CGEP events and our Twitter handle, which is at Columbia U Energy. Again, that's hashtag CGEP events and our Twitter handle at Columbia U Energy. Now that I've mangled that, let me introduce to you Kevin Knobloch.
Thank you, John, and hello to everyone. It's always fun to be here at Columbia. I had the privilege of Jeff Heal, Professor Heal, inviting me to guest lecture in his class a number of times, and I always tried to answer that question mark, doing well by doing good, as yes, you can do that. And it's great fun to also be here with my colleagues from the Department of Energy, John and also with Nancy. So in a brisk 20 minutes, what I'm going to do is give you a preview, because we have not published. We intend to publish in the next 2 to 3 weeks. We're feverishly drafting, and there's a, given the format, which I'll explain, there's a little twist here that will help you understand why it's taking a little bit longer. But and as a consequence, you won't get the full richness of actually what a lot of the corporate leaders we talked to said. But that'll give you a reason to look for the report. But what you will get is a good flavor of what we found. So you see the title of our report, and what we were up to was really looking to provide a timely, accurate, and nuanced understanding of the perspectives of key economic leaders, both U.S.-based companies and investment firms, but also multinationals doing business in the U.S. market. That was our focus, toward energy and climate policies, with the predicate that we were heading into an increasingly carbon-constrained world. That was kind of a price of admission. The participants who agreed to be interviewed kind of had to be comfortable with that as a premise. And personally don't think that was a reach, scholarly or otherwise. So what we set up, what we were trying to learn was what do corporate leaders, investors, other economic leaders, what would they like to see in terms of climate and energy policies from the international, national, regional, state, and local levels, as well as government programs, finance mechanisms, and so on, that would allow them to both reduce greenhouse gas emissions and prosper, grow their companies, generate profits, add jobs, create investor return and shareholder value. That sweet spot is what we were looking at, is policies that would do both, reduce greenhouse gas emissions and generate economic activity. And part of what got us to this question was a sense that we're at an inflection point, where we've seen over the last 5, 7, 10 years striking progress in the private sector in advancing clean energy technologies and activities and efforts to lower carbon. And we had a little bit of a working thesis that it's the trifecta of robust investment, both public investment and investment by companies in innovation, clean energy R&D, smartly crafted public policies, and leadership. That trifecta was actually a key to this progress that we have been able to track. And so you're going to know, many of you will know this story as you track energy, but let me just quickly tip through it, because this is sort of when I say we're at an inflection point, this is the point at which we're at. Utility scale distributed wind. In 2008, we had 25 gigawatts nationally, and today we have more than 82 gigawatts. The cost has dropped sharply. We have our first offshore wind farm off of Block Island, and now states, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, North Carolina, and others starting to jockey to build out that brand new industry, which has had great success in Europe. Utility scale residential solar, a very similar story, where 2008, 1.2 gigawatts nationally, almost 40-fold increase in the intervening time, sharp reductions in cost. The Sunshot that you see on the slide is a Department of Energy goal-setting program that the 2020 goals, it looks like we will hit them well before 2020, we being the industry and the greater economy. LED lights, you know this story, 450 million already installed in the U.S. alone. And you can go to your local Ace Hardware and get it for $2. Same story in electric vehicle batteries. Cost has dropped sharply. There are now in the showroom some 45 choices of battery electric vehicles, all EV or plug-in hybrids, versus only one in 2008. And now there are 765,000 on the road in the U.S., 3 million internationally, and analysts are estimating we'll have 127 models to choose from in the next 5 years. So that's the clean energy side, but there's some other interesting things happening. The nuclear energy sector, it's still roughly providing about 20% of our national energy needs, but we've gone from a peak of 104 nuclear reactors in this country down to 99 just the last 5 years. There are new retirements coming. Another 7 reactors at 5 plants have been announced. In that sector made a little bit of progress with the Watts Bar 2 reactor in Tennessee coming online in 2016, and there are 2 advanced water reactors, Westinghouse plants being built in Georgia. We know that coal-fired power plants have been closing at a brisk pace, and by the way, this pace has not slackened over the last year plus. But you can see from these numbers, 531 coal-fired units representing almost 56 gigawatts of capacity have been retired, and utilities are announcing another raft of them for the next short term. By the way, that plant is the Pleasant Prairie coal-fired power plant in Wisconsin in that photo. This is an Alabama plant that has been converted from coal to natural gas. So natural gas continues to grow across the economy. and now has surpassed coal. Not very long ago, accounted for 50% of our national energy source supply. Now we have natural gas surpassing it as the dominant national energy source, and new natural gas plants coming online. Domestic oil, because of shale oil drilling in great part, has positioned the U.S. to surpass Saudi Arabia in daily production of crude. And the combination of this increased domestic production and fuel efficiency of our vehicle fleet, not just passenger vehicles, but increasingly medium and heavy-duty trucks, has actually reduced our annual imports of oil by more than 2 million barrels per day. So that's kind of the landscape within which we did this work. We set out with an aspirational list of some 100 companies, investment firms, labor unions, industry trade groups, et cetera. We started reaching out to them to ask if they would participate in this interview. And in the end, we interviewed 53. We were aiming for 50, and so we just get over the line, really focusing on sectors that produce energy or use it intensively. Here's an example of who we engage by sector: motor vehicle manufacturers, electric utilities, oil, gas, coal, et cetera. When you get down into the clean energy sector, it starts to sort of take a more defined shape. There are the renewable energy developers, but then there are transmission developers, and there's some overlap. There are the energy management services folks. We wanted to talk to a range of corporations outside the direct energy sector, but who have to deal with that. And so industrial, we talked to a number of folks in the aluminum and steel sector, for example, as well as IT and consumer corporations. Industry trade groups. Corporate alliances, these are like Ceres and Advanced Energy Economy and CDP, BSR. They typically nonprofits that have as members of some shape or form corporations. And you'll hear from Nancy. Her organization has a similar kind of corporate council. And then here are the numbers. The 53 breaks down, and I grouped together the labor unions and the industry trade groups from those sectors in with the actual companies, so you can get a feel for it. Very healthy representation from utilities, the industrial corporations. We ended up talking to 4 labor unions plus the AFL, so this is slightly misleading because they're spread across. And I think we talked to 8 or 9 industry trade groups. So we're in. I mentioned this little step in the process, which is to improve our response numbers, we offered to anybody who participated they could do the interview on the record or off the record. We preferred on the record, but we were most interested in their perspective, and we wanted to be able to capture that. And so. And for everybody, we said, even if you're on the record, we're going to come back to you with the quotes from the interview that we would like to use. We recorded, with their permission, all but one interview, so we were able to check their quotes against the recordings. So we're in that process now, and as you can imagine, that's quite retail. And so what you see this list here is actually from the folks who have already okayed their quotes. Most of these did them on the record, a few off the record, but then have since approved quotes. So this gives you a flavor of some of the companies and organizations that sat down with us. Approvals just came in today was ArcelorMittal, the largest steel manufacturer in the world, based out of Luxembourg, and United Steelworkers. Leo Gerard, the president, sat for an interview. We just got those approvals today. So the idea was to do these in-depth interviews, to glean what we learned from them to inform primary policy findings, which I'm going to present to you tonight, along with recommendations. And we've put a working group together of smart policy people. We're going to look at all of this. We're in this process now. What might we recommend related to changes, additional policy, tweaks in policy, et cetera, that will hit that sweet spot that I talked about? Allow the private sector to both sharply reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but also economically prosper. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but the protocol, I'm not an academic, so when I landed at the Fletcher School, I was schooled on the Institutional Review Board, which I know Jeff and others are very familiar with. So that we've been, and this is by federal statute, any research involving people, human participants, let's say, has to undergo and be reviewed and approved and go by their rules. 60-minute interviews, I mentioned on or off the record, and opportunity to confirm. Not going to spend a lot of time on these, but we gave the questions in advance. And so right up, what's your company or firm's vision for prospering in a carbon-constrained world? Given your perspective of the sector that you're in, well, how do you think about the role of government? We got some really fascinating stuff back. And then of the existing infrastructure, the existing suite of public policies related to clean energy or climate change, which ones have been beneficial to your company in terms of expanding markets, economic activity, which have been impediments? And I can tell you there's some, as we socialize this project in the world, there was a fair amount of hand-wringing about, my God, don't ask those questions because you might not like the answers. But the whole point of the exercise is we're very curious about those answers, and anybody in any aspect of this world ought to be. How would you adjust any of the policies? What additional policies? And by the way, when I say policies, we're talking about public policies, government incentive programs, investment programs, public-private partnerships, anything along those lines. And then we did not want this to be a Trump versus Obama, or what's going, what do you think about the Trump administration project? However, and that is to say, we wanted our participants to look way back, back to the Clean Air Act of amendments of 1990, if you wish, and we wanted them to look forward. However, there was no avoiding the fact that we were doing this research during the first year of the Trump administration, and so we asked straight out, "What do you think? Is the policies of this administration helpful in the context of the question, the core question? Positive, negative, etc." I'm just going to move right through these because I want to get to the findings. But you can see we asked about distinctions between domestic and foreign markets. What do you see as the biggest challenges? All right. So we came up, we've distilled it so far into 12 policy, what we're calling primary policy findings. And the first one is that an accelerated transition to a low-carbon economy would create welcome economic activity. This was a striking sentiment expressed across sectors, across type of organization, but often in some interesting ways. Also, respondents typically would flag that they felt like if companies failed to seize this economic opportunity, that there was risk. There was a sense when we asked about the Trump administration, what's happening now, that this clean energy transition that I was documenting early on in the presentation is going on irrespective of what's happening in Washington today. And in fact, some actors, We Are Still In movement, for example, are doubling down. And that really has both, it's coming out of C-suites in terms of we have to keep going, and I'll give you a sense of that, of why, but also they're paying attention to those other non-federal actors. Jobs was a key theme, and yes, it was there for the four labor unions and the AFL-CIO that we spoke to, but a number of other companies were really talking about that. And it's noteworthy that when you go from coal to a natural gas plant, you're going from 100 to 10 jobs. And when you go from coal to a renewable plant, you're going from 100 to 1 jobs, and so on. It's on people's minds. And this is a big one. Significant capital is looking at clean tech from the sidelines, but not yet flowing at scale. A lot of talk about how it's easy to raise capital in foreign capitals for activity here in the U.S. than it is in the U.S. Still a lot of nursing of wounds from the 2006 to 2010 venture capital foray into renewable energy, where a lot of money was lost. Not sure whether the time's right. And what we really found was it's pretty darn ripe. Policy finding 2, that there was overwhelming support for clear federal policy on energy and carbon to provide long-term certainty and allow business to invest with confidence. A real unhappiness with policy at the federal level shifting around from administration to administration, and states coming up with a whole array of different kinds of policies without a unifying federal overview. And this is putting the same point in a positive spin, that government with strong, clear policies can help U.S. companies capture first-mover advantage and allow businesses to invest with confidence if there's a more stable long-term approach. Companies prize, this is no surprise, but companies prize policy predictability. And these are the words that we kept hearing back: holistic policy, coherent, consistent, and they far prefer it over state and local patchwork. That's, you'll see in a moment, that's not to say that they're saying there shouldn't be state leadership and state policy. A sense that the fragmented state of U.S. policy, especially vis-a-vis a China that has an autocratic setup and therefore is easier in a sense, put out clear policy, but even in places like the EU. This came from people across the spectrum. Outcome-based policies are more effective than technology mandates. Don't tell us that we have to purchase X number of LED lights. Tell us what the carbon standard is. Tell us what the efficiency standard is. And let the technology, let us in the private sector do what we know how to do best. And this last point was not widely shared, but it was there, a sense that can we get back to the good old days when we could talk policy on the merits. Finding 3, consistent economy-wide carbon price was widely seen as an essential policy step. You won't be surprised that design preferences differ. But the call, that this seemed to transcend sort of the ExxonMobil calling for a carbon tax when it didn't seem anywhere remotely politically feasible. This is now the mantra we heard back from interviewee after interviewee across the economy. And that carbon pricing legislation people saw as providing a comprehensive basis for private investment. Not to be surprised, there's disagreement on the best form. The agreement was over carbon price, but then, of course, there's different approaches. There was still a fair number of adherents for a cap-and-trade system. And this I didn't expect. And this came out of I'm talking about the border adjustment fees. This came out of the aluminum and steel industry primarily. The sense that our domestic industry has gotten lean over time. It's still carbon intensive, but because energy is such a big input and they have to compete in a carbon intensive, trade sensitive world, that we can compete against steel makers and aluminum makers in any other country from a carbon perspective, and that they would welcome this. This carbon border adjustment is something that the Climate Leadership Council, the Republicans, Jim Baker, George Shultz, Marty Feldman, et cetera, have advocated for. This is one of their recommendations. Climate change is an issue of global economic competitiveness. And what we really came to appreciate was certainly the companies based abroad doing business here are by definition multinational. I think Schneider Electric said we have to talk to 140 different countries and figure out their policies and navigate that world. But the U.S.-based companies are also increasingly international, and so they flag this a lot. And it's a highly competitive international market. Trade rules matter in a carbon-constrained world. And again, from the steel and aluminum industry, heavy industry, they fretted some that by definition they're carbon intensive. They'll do what they can to decarbon, decarbonize, but can they be considered in a relative, I'm simplifying, relative form to, say, an IT company that just has some servers to worry about. And this is actually the point they were making, that poorly crafted policies can make us less competitive globally, and if we're ahead of the pack in terms of carbon pollution, then you want to be sensitive to that and not throw us out of competition by misdesigning policy. And then echoing the Trump administration concerns, there's a lot of concern that the U.S. is going to lose its global edge to technological edge to other companies. China, of course, comes up all the time. Near universal support from the private sector for staying in the Paris Climate Accord. Not everybody spoke to this, but everybody who raised it in the interview, save one, felt very strongly it was a mistake to pull out. And here's some of the themes: global economic competitiveness, convergence of global policy with global market share. We should have a seat at the table. And one of the most striking things was, what did it get us? It didn't put us in any advantage. In fact, it pulled us out of the table. And in fact, one of the coal companies we talked to, Cloud Peak, which is a Wyoming surface mining enterprise, Colin Marshall, the CEO, was quite visible in opposing our withdrawal, and he said that he got knocked around a little bit from some of his colleagues for taking that position. Number 6, change in the electricity sector is happening fast, and policy must keep pace. We talked to a number of utilities, and it was interesting. They were, for the most part, were pretty bullish about paying attention to their carbon output, but they were very clear, whether they're a regulated utility or in a competitive market, they have to worry about reliability, security, safety, resilience, and most poignantly, affordability came up again and again, and you're going to see that theme again in just a moment. The Clean Power Plan, which President Trump ordered his EPA administrator to back us out of, without exception was seen as a focusing mechanism for the utilities that are subject to it or would be subject to it. And in fact, virtually all said that they expect to meet or exceed the targets. And then this is what I was referring to, and this came up from some of the auto companies and mostly the utilities. Beware of policies that have low to moderate income people subsidizing the affluent. The notion that net metering rules and tax credits for solar panels subsidize the wealthy because typically they can afford whatever marginal additional cost there is, and so on and so forth. And some make the argument that well, that's fine in terms of getting the industry going, but we were hearing from some of these corporate leaders that this is something to pay attention to and be careful not to overreach on. I'm going to move through these. The DOE reliability NOPR, notice of proposed rule, is definitely inside baseball. Some of you may have tracked it. Secretary Perry, head of DOE, proposed that FERC adopt a rule that would basically lead to subsidizing coal and nuclear power plants for reliability purposes, and FERC voted unanimously to not do so in pretty short fashion. And there were a couple exceptions to our interviewees, but most of them actually thought that was wrong-headed. This next to the last point, competitive electricity markets are more attractive to direct power purchases. You have a lot of corporations now that are buying renewable energy. They're investing in building wind and solar plants and or buying directly from those developers, and that's seen as a real game changer. Policy finding 7. This is basically saying that federal tax and technology policies that support private sector development and deployment of clean technology have strong fans. I've shared with people that after our service at the Department of Energy for 4 years, I was really struck by some vast percentage of the DOE programs are aimed at supporting American companies in the energy sector in one way or another, and it's noticed. Broad support exists for time-limited incentives for emerging technologies. The investment tax credit and the production tax credit for wind and solar are now on a 5-year phase-out, and that generally is supported both on the oil and gas side and on the renewable side as a great operating principle that public tax benefits should be for early technology, early industries, and then phased out. However, many said they want a level playing field, and that we got that from all over, and as they say, where one stands depends on where one sits, so there's some rich discussion in there. This was fascinating. The investors we talked to, almost to a person, said that they prefer the companies and technologies that they invest in not be reliant on public policy for financial success. They would rather go there first. However, when you ask them about some of the early investment programs, they say, well, yeah, we actually value government's role in helping these young technologies go forward. I'm just mindful of time, so I'm going to just quickly go through these last 4. Corporate policies and strategies are moving the clean energy economy forward, often dramatically. And I really came away from this work thinking about corporate policies as being every bit as important as government policies because of what they have the ability to do. And I mentioned the direct purchase of renewable energy by large companies. You can imagine if you host a Google, a Microsoft, an Apple in your state, and they have some energy-consuming servers, and they want to go 100% renewable energy, and you happen to be 70% dependent on coal in your state's electricity mix, you're going to not feel so good, and you're going to be wanting to figure out what can be done there. We saw over and over again companies that set their own ambitious greenhouse gas reduction targets are improving their environmental performance, often irrespective of policy. It's often hand in hand with some of the NGOs, these corporate alliance programs. I mentioned this before, energy-intensive industries have a built-in incentive to reduce energy, and some of these financial disclosure and data tracking efforts are actually producing results. I won't spend much time on this other than there's an acknowledgement, particularly state renewable electricity standards that are in 29 states plus the District of Columbia, almost as many energy efficiency standards, that they actually have created a lot of economic activity. There was some talk about wanting streamlining of permitting for siting and so on. And I put this on here because I'm not surprised that the coal mining industry would make this point, or oil and gas would make this point, but the wind developers raised this issue. Nuclear energy, natural gas, carbon capture and storage are essential parts of the puzzle. There's a sense, certainly among the nuclear industry, utilities that own nuclear assets, et cetera, that nuclear energy should be properly valued as a zero-carbon source. A couple states, Illinois, New York, have actually put policies in place that create a zero-emission tax credit. There is a concern about the closure rate. The average nuclear plant is somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 megawatts. That's a lot of wind and solar to replace that lost capacity with, or demand-side management. And then natural gas stays, it remains a big part of the puzzle, as I talked about early on. Finding 11 is that public investment in early-stage clean energy technology innovation is crucial across all the economic sectors. It drives innovation. The importance of company-funded R&D. A lot of companies have their own basic R&D programs. It's not typically public knowledge what they're investing in, but there's a lot of economic activity there, and somehow there's a sense that we should better understand what that is and maybe coordinate technology transfer policies. And just an overall sense that as technology costs drop, these clean energy markets are expanding rapidly. And then last, investing in clean energy, in energy infrastructure should be a priority. This is the Block Island, Deepwater Wind Farm under construction that you see there. Strong interest in terms of thinking about investing in infrastructure as including, say, offshore wind transmission, for example. Interest in electrifying the economy is significant among utilities and motor vehicle manufacturers, but needs careful analysis. So you have people in both some utility leaders and auto manufacturers saying it's one thing to electrify transportation, it's quite another to electrify home heating and factory energy, et cetera. Natural gas is more affordable, et cetera. So there's an interesting debate you'll see there. And then lastly, the offshore wind industry is poised to take off, but there's investment needed in transmission infrastructure. This is our project team. My co-investigator is Bobby Cates Garnick, and our overseer is Kelly Sims Gallagher up at the Fletcher School. Thank you very much.
Kevin, thank you very much. We're going to flip over now into our panel discussion. And I'm really pleased that we have such excellent additional participants in that. And let me just start, if I might, by asking the views of the three panelists who've not spoken yet for their reflections on this kind of core duality of that Kevin's research focuses on, the idea of doing the right thing for the climate while also prospering as companies. So, I mean, I think that we often hear this idea of economics versus environmental protection. In this sense, I think we're talking about whether we wish for these companies to be good citizens or wise capitalists or perhaps both. So maybe, Nancy, I could start with you. Are these conflicting objectives, or should corporate executives be seeking to protect the climate because they're good corporate citizens, or they're smart business people, or both? And maybe you could just comment a bit on the work that you lead at C2ES in terms of the Business Environmental Leadership Council. And over to you.
Sure. Thanks, John. Yeah, this is picking me up now. So the work that I do at C2ES, I manage our Business Environmental Leadership Council. As John mentioned, we call it the BELC, lovingly. It's not the best acronym, but C2ES as a whole is an independent nonprofit think tank. We put out independent research on climate and energy solutions. That being said, our BELC is a big part of what we do. The businesses who are part of this leadership council are frontrunners in the work that they're doing. They care about climate energy. They have signed on to core principles that say we believe climate change is happening. It's a big enough deal now to start working on it, and we believe in a market-based mechanism to control for greenhouse gas emissions. And so the work that we do, we bring the business leaders together with policymakers, that's both at the federal, state, local level, to try to get that conversation happening, to try to figure out what are the smartest, most practical solutions. That's, you know, practical is probably one of the key pieces of the work that we do, because we try to walk that middle line in terms of finding solutions that make sense for business, but also make sense for the environment. So I guess maybe from there I'll pivot to your question, John, because I think that more and more that those things go hand in hand, that companies are seeing that to be a good corporate steward of the environment also has value to the company. I mean, a lot of the investments the companies are making right now in efficiency have paybacks. So companies are seeing an impact on their bottom line, a very positive one, that encourages them to keep investing in those sorts of solutions. Likewise, I think that it's important because of other topics that came up. I think Kevin mentioned them in his presentation. The investor community is also asking questions, and so this comes to a bigger cost of capital sort of question down the road, longer term likely for these businesses. And then thirdly, workforce. Maintaining a talented workforce is becoming more and more important for some of these major companies. So they understand that a clean business also draws more talent, and they want the best and the brightest working for those companies. So altogether, I think that those pieces pull together a solid rationale for companies to really care and act on climate change.
Jeff, let me reframe the same question to you, but using the name of your course, Doing Well by Doing Good, ? Are these objectives that are compatible always, sometimes? What are your observations?
Well, they have to be compatible. This is going to happen. I mean, companies will not do things which lead them to lose money, obviously. I think they are compatible in a lot of cases. I mean, the cost of renewable energy has fallen dramatically, I mean, almost unbelievably in the last 10 years. And currently, today, the least expensive ways of producing electric power in the US are wind and solar, and much cheaper than coal, much cheaper than nuclear, and competitive with gas in most locations. So, in some sense, the market is just working there. I mean, wind and solar are taking over as sources of electric power because they're least expensive, not because of any particularly idealistic reasons. So I think that doing well and doing good are coinciding in this situation. And that wasn't the case 10 years ago. 10 years ago, renewable energy was more expensive than gas and as expensive as coal. But I mean, Kevin pointed out how many coal-fired power stations are closing. They're closing simply because they're more expensive. And again, this is not a piece of idealism on the part of utilities. I mean, they're closing coal-fired power stations down because they're just much more expensive to run today than wind and solar. So I think that the market, the costs have fallen to a point now where the market is just driving a lot of this.
Right.
Not all of it. I mean, we still need some interventions and some policies, but a lot of what we need to happen is happening just because of the fact that the costs of clean power have fallen so dramatically.
So, John, I'd like to draw you in, and in particular draw on your experience as an investor in energy companies, both for reflections on this doing well by doing good, but also as you watch the move of shareholder activism in relation to climate change, how powerful a force do you think that is? And by the way, I'll encourage that this works best if this is a live conversation, so feel free to contradict everything that John says after he's done speaking.
Yeah, I thought you were going to ask me to contradict Jeff, which I would never do, given that he's got 18 books, 200 articles, and teaches a course on this subject. So I don't know if these mics are on. I guess
Yes,
the mic
yes,
is on
yeah.
now. Yeah. Basically, I agree with both comments that were just made. I mean, it strikes me that, in my experience, most people running companies are honest. Most people that run companies are pragmatic. They're very focused, as was mentioned, on obviously delivering returns to their shareholders. But they also have other obligations and other clienteles, whether it's their customers, their employees, and the energy business regulators. I think we also have to be careful not to just be U.S.-centric. There's a different conception of what a corporation is and what duties people who manage companies have. There are slight differences between, say, the United States and between Europe and Asia as well. In my experience, and I agree, there's a convergence of all these things. So I remember when we were putting together an event at the White House where we were honoring companies that we felt were doing progressive things in clean energy, and I called upon, I complimented a woman who was representing coal department stores as being sort of, out there representing truth, light, and justice and everything else, and she kind of looked at me and said, look, we're doing this because it's good business. And that goes to Jeff's point. I mean, ultimately, the decline of coal is primarily because of what's happening in gas and other things. So with respect to the other part of your question, I do think that shareholder activism is very important because it's one of those constituencies that I mentioned. And when you look at who one's shareholders are, it also depends, and that's why different companies act differently. So if you have the pension funds as large investors in your company, and you have CalPERS lighting the news up, you're going to be a little more sensitive than if maybe you have a private company with other corporate clients, for example.
Jeff, please
Yeah,
jump
to
in.
pick up that point. In a class I finished just half an hour ago or so, I was talking with the students here about a letter
Can you
that...
pull the mic a little closer to you?
Sure, yeah. A letter that was recently written by Larry Fink, who's the chief executive of BlackRock, which is it's a fairly low-profile company, but it's to the general public, but it's actually the biggest asset manager in the world. It has about $6.5 trillion of assets under management. And he recently wrote a letter, which caused considerable surprise, actually, was widely reported in the financial press, wrote a letter to all the CEOs of the companies he invests in, which is CEOs of pretty much all major companies, saying that he, as a shareholder of theirs, regarded it as very important that they worry about climate change. About a whole range of other things as well, but climate change quite specifically. And I think that the shareholder activism is a very powerful force. I mean, BlackRock did that, and it's one of theirs, as it's the biggest asset manager in the world. Vanguard, which is the second biggest, has also done that. Vanguard manages about $5 trillion worth of assets, and they've taken a similar position. The Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is another some multi-trillion-dollar investment, is famous for its very aggressive stance on CSR issues and climate change. And the Norwegians, ironically, recently decided to divest from fossil fuels, which I think, given that all their money comes from fossil fuels, is really quite a head-spinning event.
Is it your understanding that that was a policy comment or a kind of risk mitigation? They didn't want to over-concentrate their exposure?
I think it's a bit of both. Yes. Yeah, they wrote a long letter about it, and they delved into all of those issues. Yes. And I think that, picking up a point that was made earlier, I mean, I think that companies operate in three markets. There's a product market, a labor market, and the capital market. And I think that taking action on these issues helps them in all three of those markets. I mean, in the product market, they look better, their reputation is enhanced, and it makes customers more willing to deal with them. In the labor market, as you mentioned, I mean, it's easier to get good employees.
Right.
And here at Columbia, we find that students are much more interested in working for companies that have a good profile, a good reputation than others. Nobody wants to work for tobacco companies. Nobody wants to work for a
well, that raises an interesting point. I mean, we've heard a lot in the year and change since the change of administration about companies and states and localities saying we are still in. But that raises the opposite question, because we know that not all corporations are still in. We know that some are not. But, I wonder, Kevin, you made the point that the companies that you spoke to had to be willing to accept the premise that they are living in an increasingly carbon-constrained world. How does one characterize the companies that are not in, that are not inclined to view that the world in that way? Are there overarching observations that any of you on the panel would make?
Well, clearly fossil fuel companies are not particularly happy with that. I mean, this is an existential threat to a lot of them. The market capitalization of the U.S. coal industry in 2011 was $40 billion. Today it's $3 billion. I mean, essentially it's been wiped out. And that's happening to coal industry around the world. The big question now is, when will that happen, or will it happen to the oil and gas industry? So, I mean, this is a major threat to some very profitable industries.
Let's come back to oil and gas in a minute. Kevin, did you want to jump in?
Well, to re-emphasize your point that in our project there was several levels of subjectivity. There was, we were trying to make some decisions about who to approach and invite, and then we wanted to be diverse. We wanted to have very healthy representation from the fossil fuel industry, among others. But then also who agreed to do it was a self-selection process. So it was an empirical exercise in the concept of very real information from real individuals, but it's not a quantitative study and so on. That said, the people in the fossil fuel industry we spoke to did not dispute that climate change was real and underway and that humans were causing it, did not dispute that they had to pay attention to it. Some of them were pretty grumpy about it, and for obvious reasons, as Jeff says. If I may, just the additional point I wanted to make is about how companies are approaching this. There are a number of these corporate alliances and efforts. So CDP is an example, which used to be known as the Carbon Disclosure Project. The idea that it would be a reliable, honest broker where you could register your carbon footprint, your carbon output, companies around the world. And they have thousands of participants, including governments and so on. The phenomenon they were pointing out is that once companies sign up, and I think probably 10 years ago it was probably an attitude, certainly in the NGO world, that We had to do a lot of arm twisting to get these companies to try to step up on these issues. But what we were hearing back from these alliances is companies, once they sign up and buy in, their corporate culture takes over. And particularly when there's metrics that they're measuring themselves against. And then all of a sudden it starts to bleed into corporate policy. And I'm not suggesting that's uniform, but it was an interesting finding that suggests that whole corporate engagement effort is maturing to a really interesting place where the corporations themselves are owning much more of it.
John, you want to come in and then
Yeah,
Nancy?
yeah. I was just going to say, I think, and there are exceptions to this, but most companies, at least in my experience, are not run by ideologues. Mm-hmm. They're run by pragmatic people that are attempting to maximize, and good companies maximize over a long period of time, shareholder value. And so the energy business, and there are obviously exceptions as technology changes what the energy business is, but historically at least, is a long-lived, capital-intensive industry marked with volatility. But so what if you are running, if you're the CEO or you're an investor in a big company, or if you're BlackRock and you're looking, you have to make decisions that are with respect to capital investments that will pay back over decades. So, and if you're a pragmatic person and you see the way the world is going and all this convergence and all these things, you're not going to bet against the movement of the world towards cleaner energy. It just would be imprudent. And so, for example, Jim Rogers obviously was a CEO of a large utility for many years, made that point in the same room 6 months ago. I do think there are elements of certain industries, in the fossil industry, for example, notably in the coal industry, particularly in this country, there are portions of that industry that are sort of have their gander up and are ideologically motivated. Their side of it is that they feel that they've been treated like tobacco executives, and that they're, very good men and women that have been working in this country for decades, providing up to 50% electricity, and they feel like they're being treated with disrespect. And so then you get the emotions up, et cetera. But in general, my experience is that people leading companies are looking at these things fairly pragmatically.
Okay. Nancy, please.
Yeah, if I could just jump in, I agree with a lot of what John had to say and others. But in terms of, your original question was about we are still in and who's not still in. And I mean, there are 1,700 companies in the U.S. that have pledged support for the Paris Agreement and continuing to work. And I also would hesitate against classifying any company who has a heavy GHG footprint or works in the extractives industry as potentially not in terms of addressing climate change. As John mentioned, they're working on long time frames. They're trying to maximize shareholder value. But at the same time, there are steps that companies are taking. I can speak specifically for our Business Environmental Leadership Council, which, as I mentioned, all of those companies have pledged support for market-based mechanisms to constrain carbon, and those are a wide variety of companies, some that are oil and gas companies, some that are manufacturing or chemicals or aluminum manufacturing, so really big, heavy industries who are trying to make those steps. But what those companies need are some sort of mechanism that signals a market price for them to figure out how to make those changes make sense from a business perspective.
Well, and that brings up the issue that, Kevin, you emphasized in your presentation about policy predictability. And, as I've had discussions with people in the current administration about the placement, the relative importance or lack of importance given to climate policy, the response that one often gets, and it's not an unreasonable response on a certain level, is elections matter. That's kind of almost all uniformly an answer that one gets. But even if elections matter, the choices that seem to be made by the current administration don't even line up with longstanding policy of both parties, progressively, maybe some would say too slowly, but step by step moving toward more engagement on the climate issue. So I'm interested in the views of the panelists as to how seriously the current discontinuity, if that's how you want to view it, or the impact of the last U.S. election, how much it could affect choices by these corporations, and if not much, why not? Want to kick us off?
Thank you, John. You know, I mentioned in my presentation that I was struck during our time at the Department of Energy by the large percentage of Department of Energy programs, starting with the 17 national labs, the applied energy programs, et cetera, ARPA-E, the loan program, that are really there and designed to help companies in various ways, typically to help them invest in early stage technology development, research development, deployment, get young companies, young technologies through the valley of death to commercialization and so on. And we heard that in our research, and this was including the fossil industry, the nuclear industry, et cetera, that the Trump administration's proposed budget cuts, first in FY18 and then what's shaping up for 19, were something they were alarmed about. That it was cutting deeply into our basic science and technology research and development budgets, and that was if that went through, that was going to harm U.S. industry and U.S. companies and U.S. jobs. And we heard that again and again. And then programs like the Advanced Manufacturing Office. These are in the Department of, these are voluntary programs that have a lot of support out there in the private sector.
John, you want to come in?
Yeah. You know, having had a background in finance and then having spent 4 years in the government, as I've often said, as an investor, I never once stepped foot in the Department of Energy, and I didn't really know even hardly what it did, and frankly, I didn't care that much. I spent 4 years there, and I really came to understand how important the department is in the work of the government. But having said that, I think it's easy for those of us that have spent a lot of time there to overstate the impact that the federal government really has. This country's never had a coherent national energy policy. We worked for 4 hard years to try to move us in that direction. Energy has always been marked by federal, state, and local influences in this country. And now, perversely, some of the things that got in our way when we were trying to shape a coherent policy are now the things that I'm deeply relying on to save our nation. So, without getting more political than that, that's sort of my take of it.
Yeah, I'd like to back that. I mean, I think that I'm not worried that the federal support for renewable energy is declining, because renewable energy can stand on its own feet at this point.
Right.
And, you know, there was an interesting piece, if you're interested in the numbers here. Lazard, the investment bank, has a piece on its website about the cost of different ways of generating electricity. If you Google Lazard LCOE, LCOE stands for levelized cost of electricity, you'll get to it. And they show that as of the end of last year, the cost of generating a kilowatt hour of power from wind was about 3 cents. From solar was about 4 cents. From gas, natural gas, it was about 5.5 cents. From coal, it was 9 cents. And from nuclear, it was about 15 cents. So coal and nuclear are totally priced out of the market at this point. No one in their right mind would even think of building a coal-fired power station or a nuclear power station. And this is not for reasons of pollution, it's just straightforward basic economics. It's financial suicide to try to build those things today. Gas is just about in the running. It's more expensive than coal, than wind and solar, but only slightly so. So, you know, in that situation, and what the federal government does in terms of subsidizing renewable energy doesn't matter that much. Now, I think that what it does matter is what Kevin was talking about, which is some of the support for early stage technologies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, those are very vulnerable, and I think that the cutback in funding for early stage technologies is probably more serious than the cutback in direct support for renewable energy.
So I'm going to come to you, Nancy, but let me load another question on top of it. I want to go back to the exchange that we started to have about the fossil energy companies, and in particular the oil and gas companies. I'm sure that many in the audience have noticed over the last couple of years an increasing entry by a number of the big oil and gas giants into the clean energy space with big equity investments in solar companies and battery companies and so forth. Statoil, for its part, just announced that it was going to, assuming the board approves, rename itself as Equinor, and with the goal of a 15 to 20% of its total capital investment in clean energy technologies by, I think, a decade from now. 10 of the biggest oil and gas companies internationally, interestingly, none of the U.S. Oil and gas majors, have forged a new alliance called the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative. But one hears and so all of this could be taken as a sense that some of the most heavy hitter incumbents feel that their world is changing and they need to invest differently for a clean energy future. Others say that the DNA of these big conventional players is just all wrong for the clean energy economy that will be, by its nature, inherently disruptive. So, Nancy, I'm unfairly asking you to double up and both comment on that question, your views about it, as well as your thoughts on the previous question, if you will.
Thanks, John. Yeah, just to go back to the previous question in terms of regulation, I was just going to throw a little bit of color on there in terms of what companies are doing despite the fact that some federal regulations are now being pulled back. So one of our business council members is DTE Energy, and we had the pleasure of giving an award to the CEO of DTE, Jerry Anderson, just 2 weeks ago in Denver at our annual Climate Leadership Conference, because Jerry ended up doubling down in terms of he had worked with states on the Clean Power Plan looking at, and for those of you who don't know DTE Energy, they're a Michigan-based utility, and so a lot of coal in their area. And he looked around and said, you know what, DTE can get the 80% reduction by 2050 out of their emissions, and put that forward as a corporate goal, and has inspired other utilities in the area to do the same. So they're saying, you know what, we can do this anyway, and it makes smart business sense for us, and so we're going to do it. So I think I just wanted to throw that in there in terms of a little extra flavor in terms of a specific company example. As far as oil and gas companies go, in my previous work at HS Market, I worked a lot with oil and gas companies, and I think that they are struggling with this long-term transition and how to think about themselves as companies. I mean, on one side, they're getting pressured by the investment community. You should be an energy company, and you should be part of the solution. So I think some of them are looking at it that, but I think in other ways there are opportunities in the change in energy solutions that are out there. So I think they see this as a growth and an opportunity for those companies. You see some companies such as Statoil or Equinor, whatever we want to call them now, they are leveraging some of their expertise and capabilities in offshore drilling to use for offshore wind. And so they're finding ways to use their intellectual capital and strengths as a company to be competitive in this new space of clean energy.
Okay, Jeff, I'd like to, if you would like to come in on this question, let me just do a public service announcement that we're just going to, in a second, take questions from the audience. So, Jeff, maybe you have a follow-up on this, and then we'll go to the audience. And is there a mic that we are to use for this purpose? Right here. Okay, Jeff, please.
So, energy companies have not in the past proven good at diversifying. They've tried to diversify and they've lost a lot of money. They've basically, to put it bluntly, screwed up. The human capital they have is very good, but it's very specific. And they're geologists and they're chemical engineers. And geology and chemical engineering don't carry a long way in building wind power stations or solar power stations.
But they're also complex project management experts, right? So
yeah,
is that not relevant?
I mean, building a solar power station is not a complex project.
Okay.
It's like putting up a Lego set. And you buy the panels, you buy the solar cells, you screw them onto panels, you put them on pillars, you hook them up together, and that's it. And last year, India built the biggest solar power station in the world, which was 0.7 gigawatts. And they built it from scratch in under a year. There's nothing else, no other power station you could build on that scale in under a year. I mean, it's not a construction. I mean, it's an assembly job rather than a construction job.
Offshore wind?
Offshore wind is more challenging, and I
Okay.
think what we just heard about Statoil is interesting there.
Right.
Their drilling technology could be useful when it comes to anchoring offshore platforms.
Okay.
But I don't have any great hopes of the oil companies reinventing themselves as beyond petroleum.
Okay. Well, that's a throwback for those of you who remember BP's campaign a few years ago. So I'd like to invite anybody from the audience who has a question to approach the microphone here. Please identify yourself and keep your question to a question. Please feel free to come up, sir. If you'd introduce yourself, please.
Gabriel Avgerinos, Energy Mentors International. I completely agree with the professor about oil and gas companies having trouble diversifying. Those of you who are like me will remember something called Exxon Enterprises, which went bye-bye very quickly and had solar, wind, and even something new called word processing. My question is the common thread electricity? And could that possibly, with the help of a policy that puts a firm number on carbon, and by that I mean a number that's somewhere between $50 and $100 per ton, not something that's in the teens, promote the oil, gas, and fossil fuel companies to start looking at themselves more like Total does? In other words, 5 years from now, the majority of revenues of Total, which is an oil and gas company, is going to be from electricity because of acquisitions that they've done. Do you see that as a potential savior for U.S. companies? Thank you.
John, you want to kick off?
Yeah, and then obviously I'd be interested in Jeff's views. I think it might cut the other way in some ways. I mean, I agree with what Jeff said, but I'd take it one step further. It's not even just the transition from these fossil fuel companies to wind and solar, which are fairly straightforward. And, you know, if they have the desire to do it, they can go out and buy companies and maybe they can transform. But what's really happening right now in the energy industry is that we're in the beginning of a radical transformation where the role of data, for example, is going to be paramount, and so that machine learning, deep learning, artificial intelligence, the applications of those to extract the increasing amount of data, that's particularly what we're seeing in the electricity industry right now with smart meters. So I not only agree with Jeff, but I think it's going to be even more difficult for these companies to figure out how to do that. And so I think that in a few years, when you go to a big energy conference, it's going to be the Amazons and the Googles and folks we've never heard of yet who are going to be up there presenting and owning some of these assets. But others may have different perspectives.
Jeff, why don't you come on in, and if there are other people with questions, please come over to the microphone here, and we can get a couple questions going in quick succession. Jeff?
So here's a scenario for the U.S. oil and gas industry. Electric vehicles take off. They become the principal source of demand for oil is ground transportation. If electric vehicles take off, the demand for oil drops sharply. There will still be demand for oil for petrochemicals and for aircraft, but those are smaller uses than ground. If the demand for oil drops sharply, the price of oil would drop very sharply. It would drop, I would guess, down to $15 to $20 a barrel. At $15 to $20 a barrel, none of the U.S.-based companies can make money. The only oil in the world which is cheap enough to be produced at $15 to $20 a barrel is that in the Middle East. So you'd see the oil industry consolidate into the Middle East, and the U.S. and Western companies would go bankrupt. So that's my scenario for the oil and gas industry. Now, gas could contaminate. We haven't got time to go into this, but there are scenarios where you could see gas continuing as a source of electric power because it's very useful for backing up intermittent power sources. It's an alternative, if you like, to batteries. If batteries come down enough in price, gas will go the way of coal. But if they don't, then gas could still have a place in the market.
Great. Thank you. Quick introduction, quick question, and then we'll take a couple at a time. Please.
Great. Yeah, my name is Richard Moss. Jonathan, it's good to see you again after some time.
Yeah.
I'm here as a visiting scientist working on a federal advisory committee that was canceled and is working on resilience issues. I'm very happy to be here and thank the community for its support. Two quick questions. One, I'm just curious whether there was any enthusiasm for bioenergy in the energy mix that you talked about. As many of you know, if you start to think about the scenarios that get us to below 2 degrees C, bioenergy is a crucial component. And the second one is just about some of these voluntary programs. How comfortable are the corporate leaders and those who are implementing them in the accounting that goes on to make sure that we're really getting the reductions that we think we're getting? And isn't there, in fact, a fair amount of additional work that needs to be done on that?
Great, thank you. Please.
Hi, how are you? My name is Luis Vallejo. I'm a first-year CIPA student. So my question is pertaining to batteries. So the biggest lithium reserves are found in Bolivia, Chile, and Argentina. So for the price to drop, what kind of solutions do you guys envision? Should there be like a political solution? Should there be like technology transfer? How can we, open the door for the prices to go down on lithium? Thank you.
Okay, great. So let me invite, Kevin, you want to kick off with the response on bioenergy and the voluntary programs?
It's a great question.
Any of it.
And we didn't hear a lot of people raising bioenergy. It kind of came up in a couple different places. We talked to a pulp and paper company that through their own sort of waste product stream from making pulp and paper can create some. They provide for all their own energy. They use it to generate electricity, and have surplus that they'd like to sell back into the local retail market. We heard that from other heavy industry as well. But the utility rules are tricky, and if they generate and try to sell too much, they get classified as utility, and that was an interesting little problem to solve, because otherwise that energy would go to waste. But so it popped up here and there. And so particularly not a lot on the biofuels side. I think the bioenergy side is more on the combined heat and power side. Growing interest in engineered wood products, cross-laminated timber, that kind of thing that you can build mid-rises and high-rises with, that are being thought of as a better carbon storage method, so you can basically lock up that carbon for significantly longer periods of time.
Nancy, please.
Yeah, just to dovetail on the bioenergy comment, I also work with a partnership called the Renewable Thermal Collaborative, and that's a partnership that C2ES has with WWF, as well as David Gardner and Associates, and we bring together industrial companies who are actually really concerned about lowering their GHG footprint and through their thermal load. So they use a lot of oil or gas to generate heat for their operations, and so bioenergy, sort of what Kevin was talking about, heat to power, different solutions in that space. They're trying to figure out how they can leverage that to meet some of their corporate goals on reducing their GHG emissions. So if you're going 100% renewable, how are you going to reduce your thermal load or reduce your emissions associated with your thermal load? And key to that is having a good accounting system. So that's one of the issues that we're talking about through this collaborative. It's just up and running for about a year, so we're trying to figure out how we can best pull together and leverage the resources and the general knowledge of all the groups that are part of the collaborative to share that with others in the corporate community or wishing to use those solutions.
Jeff, I wonder if you might want to come in on this accounting issue around the
Biofuels.
Yeah, the biofuels and so forth, and the voluntary programs that Richard Moss asked about.
Yeah. So a quick comment on biofuels. We were talking about diversification by oil and gas companies a couple of minutes ago. One area where that could make sense is into biofuels, because that's a chemical engineering area again. And Shell, in fact, has been buying a lot of biofuel companies. And they've bought up a lot of Brazilian biofuel companies, and they're investing quite heavily in biofuels. That sort of makes some sense. Yeah, there's a lot of debate about whether biofuels actually do I mean, the concept of biofuel obviously is that it's carbon neutral over its lifetime, because when the plant grows, it takes in CO2 through photosynthesis, and when you burn it, you release that CO2 back into the atmosphere. So over its lifetime, it's carbon neutral. The problem with that argument is that you use a lot of fossil fuels in growing them and fertilizing them and processing them and things like that. So they're not actually carbon neutral. And there's been a lot of argument about exactly how far from being carbon neutral they are. And the balance of the argument seems to be that the biofuels used in this country, unfortunately, which is corn-based ethanol, is very, very far from being carbon neutral, and is really adding almost no value at all to our climate change efforts. The Brazilian-based biofuels, which come from sugar, which is much more productive, you get much more sugar per hectare of land and per unit of fertilizer, those are apparently better, according to the accounting I've seen. And on the lithium issue, incidentally, just a quick comment on that. I'm told by geologists, and I know nothing about geology, so this is totally second-hand, that lithium is actually quite widely abundant in the Earth's crust. It's just we haven't looked for it very hard for a long time. And secondly, I'm also told by people in materials science that it's not actually the best metal for batteries. The magnesium is much better. And that the next generation of batteries will be magnesium ion rather than lithium ion. So the lithium shortage may well go away. And finally, lithium is very recyclable.
So, John, I know that in your time at Department of Energy, you spent a share of your focus on batteries and technology and innovation. I wonder if you might want to come in on the costs of lithium or the costs of battery storage a little bit more.
Well, I think Jeff just covered it, and I'm not a lithium expert or a battery technology expert, but I do think that the solutions are in bringing costs way down, which are happening quickly at scale, and then also these alternative types of technology, battery technologies, which the national labs have been very active at, places like Argonne National Labs, where we've worked. And so it's a larger subject that we can't get into in the remaining minutes, but this is going to enable a lot of things, including large distributed storage. And so when we've got all these electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles, despite the first fatality that happened today, I'm told, with an autonomous vehicle, but you're going to have millions of homes that are going to be plugging in and selling electricity back to the grid as distributed storage, and then the other way around. And that's going to profoundly change the structure of the grid, the need for large-scale generation, and some of the things Jeff was talking about earlier. So, okay, large subject, but.
Thank you. We're going to take these last two questions real compact, please, and then we're just about to have to wrap up. Please, fire away.
My name is Andrew. I'm a sophomore at Millbrook School. I had a question about, I know that you guys have really been analyzing a lot of the general facts about how to incorporate the corporate structure of policies and the government structure. How would you guys manage an issue, for example, that solar energy, for example, California, they have about 40% that are solar, and the amount of energy coming in from solar as an external utility is too much for that grid itself to handle. And that excess energy requires California to either sell it off or to have other states buy it from them. So something like that, with your opinion, how would you manage something like that with the companies and the policies within the state?
Thank you for the question. And please, last question.
Ken Kramer, Rushton Atlantic, also a product of the B School here. Did you, I guess, in this study, number one, was there any degree of optimism based on things I see in the U.S. government or precedents around the world of coming up with a consistent, philosophical, longer than 2-year energy policy? And was there any sense of people's sense of priority between vehicle emissions, building emissions, and power generation emissions?
Sorry, repeat that last bit.
Was as people thought about how to decarbonize and where the greatest opportunities were for the transitions we have to make, was it which of the three sectors were there more of a focus on?
So I want to ask that you not respond to the source of optimism, because I'm going to use a slightly different version of that for a wrap-up question to all four of you. But does anybody want to jump in on solar in California and managing the high production times of day there and options for responding to that, and biggest opportunities as between different sectors? Anyone want to start us off?
Sure. Certainly in terms of the utility and the renewable folks that leaders that we talk to for our project, that a theme that kept coming up was that it's the regional transmission organizations, the RTOs, the ISOs, that are really best positioned to help tackle that issue. The challenge in the electricity sector is we've got all kinds of authorities, FERC and DOE at the national level, the state energy, public service commission, state energy, all these players, but it's not always clear who should be doing what. But a lot of people are pointing at the RTOs as key, and sometimes you don't know you have a problem until you have progress. And this is a problem that's a result of renewable really growing at a pace very few expected, and in my view is a good problem. So that would be one place to look, is these existing organizations that are regional by nature, and for those regional organizations to start to talk to each other. And the other point I would make on storage is what one of our interviewees said, once we crack battery storage at scale, game over. Somebody else said time-use pricing. Once we get that across the economy, that is to say, when we can fine-tune use power when it's at least in demand and lowest cost, those two things combined with more sophisticated management of the regional and national electrons flowing around, I think they've got it right. It'll be game over or game on.
Nancy, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I mean, this is slightly off topic. I defer to the other folks in the room who are much more policy experts on this. But in terms of just corporate demand for renewables, I just wanted to throw out there that 48 deals were signed by companies just in the past year. And so the demand for that, of course, that doesn't solve the whole duck curve problem at all. That's a different issue completely. But there is growing demand for renewable resources by the corporate community.
No, I was just going to make the point that, even with today's grid, running a grid is a very complex operation, and the RTOs are the folks that are, and the ISOs responsible for that. When you start adding in large amounts of intermittent power, it gets much more complicated. And hence the gas comment that was made earlier, but also that's the important role of storage, because obviously if we get to the point with large-scale storage, then the management of that becomes easier. But these are the driving forces behind why our grid needs to become rapidly more intelligent.
Right. So let me, just as a last question to all of you, or as many as wish to jump in on it, let me take Mr. Kramer's question and slightly morph it. Should we, as we look at both the results of Kevin and his colleagues' work, and as we think about these questions more broadly, I'm interested whether we should have a sense of optimism or something less than that there's a pathway forward to consensus policymaking in this space. There's a lot of technological changes happened. A lot is possible in markets that would have been science fiction 10, 15 years ago. Does this mean that we are on a glide path to a better, more consensus-based climate policy or not?
Which end do you want to start on?
We'll start with you, John, and we'll give Kevin the last word. You can keep it as short as you want.
I'm going to keep it very. I do not have great confidence that we're going to see a national energy plan anytime soon or great consensus. I do have optimism. I believe in markets, and I believe in companies and technology, and I think that we are seeing rapidly the global energy industry going through rapid transformation that will be largely driven by economics. And I think that's going to continue regardless of what happens in the White House for the next 3 years.
Okay. Jeff?
Yeah, I second that. I totally agree. I mean, I think that the source of optimism here, if there is one, is just that the costs of renewable energy and of battery storage have come down so dramatically that we can conceive of a radically new way of generating electric power in which fossil fuel have no role. And that's quite that would have been
that's a slightly bold statement. Yeah.
No, it's not actually.
Yeah.
No, that would have been science fiction 10 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago. But today it's not. Today that's actually quite realistic, I think.
Great. Nancy?
Well, I definitely have optimism. I mean, I work at a company that's our goal. So I'm obviously continually optimistic, but I also don't see it happening in the short term. The fact that we have more corporations standing up, going up to Capitol Hill, talking about the value of a comprehensive legislation on climate definitely at least starts pushing the needle in that direction. The fact that you have a lot of folks from the conservative side coming up with plans to address it means that there has to be a conversation somewhere in the middle, and that we'll see that hopefully unfold in the coming years. But I'm going to remain optimistic.
Okay. Kevin?
I agree with what everyone on the panel has said. I think what really struck me about what we were hearing is almost to a person that the interviewees were saying, please give us a policy that is coherent, consistent, long-term, almost to the point of, and they all understood it was likely to be a carbon-constrained policy, almost to the point of, I don't care what it is, but let us know what it is, and we can deal. We can work around that. Obviously, you want something that's more thoughtful. I thought that, and I think our report is almost going to lay out a little bit of a roadmap. I don't think it's a glide path at all. I think a lot of smart and dedicated people are going to have to fight to punch this into shape. But almost a roadmap for what that policy could be that climate activists can love and C-suite leaders can get pretty energized about, because they can see where their economic future will be.
Well, that's a great note to end on. Let me just mention that this is one of a number of great events that we're going to be hosting over the coming weeks. Picking up on Jeff's emphasis of a new world in the renewable space, on March 27th at Faculty House, we will have a book talk with Dr. Varun Sivaram, who is the author of Taming the Sun, Innovations to Harness Solar Energy and Save the Planet. This is really a fabulous book and a very thoughtful speaker, and I encourage you all to participate in that if you're able. On April 19th, the Center on Global Energy Policy will have its 2018 Columbia Global Energy Summit, which will bring in a wide variety of energy thinkers and practitioners, including Fatih Birol from the International Energy Agency, Nancy's former boss Dan Yergin from IHS Markit, the former Deputy National Security Advisor Avril Haines, who is here at Columbia University now, the current Deputy Secretary of Energy, Dan Brouillette, Ajay Mathur from the Energy and Resources Institute in Delhi, and a number of others from the corporate sector. And last but not least, on this difficult question of whether we can find and build consensus in the climate space, on April 30th, an event that we actually haven't formally announced yet, we will be having another program in the series of Where Next on Climate, looking at conservative prescriptions for how to make progress in the climate space. So details on that will follow. You can get information on all of these from our website, which is energypolicy.columbia.edu. And I would ask you in closing to join me in thanking our excellent panelists for their really thoughtful comments here tonight. Thank you.